First, we want to thank our sponsor, RonPaulSwag.com, for offering listeners of this podcast the Double Down for Ron Paul sale. Reduced prices on T-shirts, posters, signs, and tons more of the Ron Paul gear over at RonPaulSwag.com. You're listening to Daily Paul Radio with Kurt Wallace at DailyPaulRadio.com and DailyPaul.com. We have a special guest with us today, Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul has been a senator for the last 2 years, elected in 2010. In full disclosure, I worked for your campaign through a consulting group doing a radio broadcast back in the election 2010, and I've worked for your father's campaign directly doing the same thing. We're talking today about the Romney endorsement, and I'm not going to be supporting Romney, and I just want to put that out there. But I appreciate you coming on, talking to the Daily Paul community, and let's go ahead and get started. I got a bunch of questions here for you. The first one is, obviously many in our movement have concerns and feel discouraged right now. What would you like to say to the Liberty movement who are upset with your endorsement of Mitt Romney?
Well, I'd say what happens is that we're in the midst of deciding where we go. You know, this doesn't go on forever. We have to decide, where does the Liberty movement go from here? And so we have to have a goal, and a goal that we can achieve, and a goal that we can fight for. And I think now is the time that we transform the goal from winning the nomination to actually fighting over the platform and fighting over the future of the Republican Party and fighting over the future of our country. But the thing is that we can't do that through the nominating process. Doesn't mean that if you don't have a state convention, you don't go forward. Iowa still has theirs. All of those people I encourage to still go and vote for Ron Paul in their conventions, because also that's how you become the delegates to the national convention, and it's how we have influence over things like the platform. And we are going to have a big influence over what happens with the platform. And my endorsement, what does that mean? You know, I guess it depends on who you talk to. To me, it doesn't mean anything with regard to my political philosophy or the things I support. And I think people need to look beyond politics to look at what's most important. What are the issues of the day? So, for example, my week this week's been a pretty typical week, but a fairly busy week. We've introduced legislation that says we'll have no domestic drone surveillance without warrants. Sort of restates the Constitution, but we think it needs to be done. We're working on legislation to end mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent crimes. We have a bill to end the TSA. So there's been one bill after another. We're working hard on Audit the Fed, and I've been meeting with both Republicans and Democrats to try to get a vote on Audit the Fed, which we think we have a reasonable chance. There's going to be a vote on it in the House. We think there's a reasonable chance we can get that in the Senate. And so I guess what I would say to detractors is we need to work on the issues and moving forward and not be too caught up in politics, which is a messy business and not always exactly what everybody wants it to be.
Next question. The number one question that was posed is the timing of the endorsement and doing it on the Hannity show.
Well, I waited to do it until the numbers were absolutely certain, and my father's campaign had announced that he wouldn't have the numbers to get the nomination. This came in after the California primary, where by almost anybody's account, Romney has somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 delegates. And so that was the timing of it. I discussed with my father the fact that I was not going to do the nomination until after he and the campaign had announced that they wouldn't have the numbers to win the nomination. And this has been obvious to a lot of people for a long time, and people love my father so much that I think sometimes they've tried to look beyond some of the facts of the delegate count. But now it's to the point where people really can't look beyond that. If they want to be realistic, they have to understand there won't be enough for the nomination, but there will be enough to influence the platform, and it'll be the largest contingent of liberty-loving Republicans ever at a convention. And like I say, we will have a large influence. I will be there in Tampa, and we will have a large influence over what comes to the platform. But even more important than the platform, though, is not just what happens in the platform. We're going to have a large influence over whether or not we get a vote on Audit the Fed and a vote on these various other activities.
What would you say to the delegates that are still fighting to get your father elected at this point?
Well, absolutely, keep fighting. The numbers are not there to get the nomination, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't still fight to be a delegate, because being a delegate is more than just the nomination. Being a delegate is being able to vote on what the platform is and what the platform becomes. So I would say keep the fight up, keep going on. And but what I would also say is that by my participating and saying I will support the nominee doesn't change me at all or any of the issues I'm fighting for, but it does change the ability of us or the liberty movement to have a voice in what becomes here. We're trying to get, for example, explicit endorsement of the bill by Governor Romney. He's endorsed the concept. We'd love for him to endorse the bill of audit the Fed. We're working on that. But we have, I think, the ability to have more say and more influence by saying we'll ultimately support the nominee. And I'll give you an example of how this isn't something new. When I ran in 2009, I promised everybody, the Republican Party included, 3 months before the primary that I would support the nominee. Now, fortunately, I was the nominee, so it was easy to support the nominee. But had my opponent won, who I wasn't particularly crazy about, I still would have supported him because I made that promise. If I hadn't made the promise, people were concerned, and people said to me, well, your dad never supports the presidential nominee and never supports the ticket. You're not a good enough Republican to be our nominee. And so it would have been difficult, if not impossible, for me to win the primary if I would have said I will not support the nominee. The same has been for the president all along. I've told people for over a year that I would support the nominee. And for those who say, oh, well, you didn't work hard enough for your dad, I take that really as an insult in the sense that, I've been working for my dad since I was 11 years old. I knocked on thousands of doors for him. I took time off from college to campaign for him for Congress and for the U.S. Senate. I took time off from medical school to campaign for him and when he ran as a libertarian for the presidency. So I sort of take it as an insult that people think that somehow I don't support my father or haven't done an adequate job in that, in the sense that I have traveled thousands of miles and been to thousands of speeches both with him and by myself. And so I think there's probably nobody within the movement that has done more to support my dad than myself.
Do you expect Ron Paul supporters to support Romney?
I don't really expect to tell them to do anything. And in fact, I've said that in multiple interviews that, Republicans in general are an independent lot, and the liberty-minded folks within the liberty movement are probably the most independent of the lot. And so people will make their own decisions. And I think there's some that won't. And I think there are some that, don't vote and don't believe in any government at all. And I think that's some of the harshest critics we have out there, or maybe people who don't participate in the process. Many of them have never chosen to register as Republicans, so I don't have much hope for them to vote for a Republican nominee. But I would say within the liberty movement, if you count people who have voted for Ron Paul or people who have voted for myself, there are millions of people, and there will be some who will consider and say, well, gosh, President Obama's just running the country into the ground, and while I don't agree with everything Governor Romney stands for, I do know that he said he'll give a waiver to all 50 states on Obamacare if the Supreme Court doesn't strike it down. I do know that he said he supports audit the Fed. I do know that Governor Romney during the debates also said that the war in Afghanistan, that we have made a mistake in the sense that we should not continue to support a fight for independence. The Afghans will have to step up if they want to gain independence and keep it from the Taliban. So while that's not perfect Ron Paul, that's not perfect non-interventionism, there is some inkling that Governor Romney isn't always as bellicose as some people make him out to be. Another example is just from his history. His mom ran for the U.S. Senate many years ago, and his mom was for ending our involvement in the Vietnam War. So people need to, I think, sometimes understand that people aren't as simple as we make them out to be. It's not always just good and evil. There are sometimes gradations between the two, and sometimes people are good on certain issues and bad on other issues. A good example is, my dad has worked with many people who he doesn't agree with. John Conyers and Bobby Scott are two, I have a lot of respect for them in the House, and I've worked with them on civil liberties issues, and so has my dad. But the thing is on economic issues, they really don't agree with us for the most part. It's the same way over here in the House, in the Senate. I've worked with Senators Merkley and Wyden and have a great deal of respect for them on civil liberties and issues of war. But on economic issues, they don't agree with us at all. They don't believe in economic liberty, many of these folks, as we see it. So Does that mean that I call them evil neocons and never speak to them? No, I mean, you get more with sugar than you get with vinegar. So I think you have to figure out how you want to approach things if you want to succeed. And sometimes that does mean compromising on strategy, but not necessarily on principle.
Senator Paul, you yourself were possibly the most recognized voice against the NDAA on the Senate floor. Can you state that you will oppose anyone that you endorse who supports the NDAA or undeclared war or an unbalanced budget or reauthorization of the Patriot Act? Will you pledge to fight when needed against somebody that you've endorsed?
Yeah, and the thing is absolutely. The thing is, it doesn't matter to me whether we have a Republican or Democrat president. It doesn't matter at all to me. The issues don't change one iota. In fact, not only on indefinite detention will my views not change, they won't on the budget either. I've told them I'm not voting for a budget unless it balances within a reasonable time, and to me that's been 5 years. And so they're already concerned I won't vote for a Republican budget if we were able to take over in November, and there's some truth to that because I've said I won't unless it balances in a reasonable time. But see, what people don't seem to realize, or some don't seem to realize in this movement, is if I had not been here, an amendment would have passed when the NDAA came up. A Republican senator introduced an amendment that said if you are found innocent of terrorism by a court in the United States, you can still be sent to Guantanamo Bay. An American citizen found innocent could still be sent, and simply through my objection and also my friendship with some Republicans who some in the liberty movement hate and deride and call names, because of my friendship with them, I got 9 Republicans and 51 Democrats, and we defeated this amendment. But it's because I don't go around calling people names, and I don't go around insulting folks that, and that, to tell you the truth, is what a lot of people don't realize is it's not my father's style either. You don't see him going around, a lot of the ranting and raving that goes on by the anonymous internet. You don't see my dad going around calling people names who he's worked with. He's worked with many people from both sides of the aisle, on issues of war and civil liberties, and it's really not his style, and I would think something that he wouldn't approve of.
Have you and your father talked about the endorsement of Mitt Romney before or since, and what was his response?
Many times, and like I say, I've been saying this for a year. I also spoke to him, the week that their announcement came out, just days before their announcement, to find out what their announcement was going to be as far as acknowledging that the nomination battle, they wouldn't have the delegates to win the nomination. So yeah, there have been many discussions between us.
Do you think your father would endorse Mitt Romney?
I don't want to speak for him, and he'll ultimately answer that. I think it's not that likely, and I think that individuals have different personalities. And what I find interesting, sometimes on the internet, is people on the internet act as if we're somehow sort of diametric opposites. But we have hundreds, if not thousands, of votes up here. And the interesting thing is, if you stacked up our voting record, there's probably 1 or 2 votes that we would have voted differently on. And in the end, if my wife were up here, we would probably disagree on at least that many. I would think that good friends within the liberty movement disagree on issues. But the problem I have is the vitriol and the anger of people who think because you disagree on a couple of issues, but you still happen to be introducing issues that nobody else, we introduced this week co-sponsored legalization of industrial hemp. Do you think those things would happen were I not here? And I guess I get a little disturbed that nobody's willing to acknowledge or care about those issues, and they seem to be overridden with politics, which in reality really are not of such great importance other than the strategy of being able to work with others.
And the endorsement of Romney, will you be releasing your donor list to the Romney campaign?
We don't release our donor list to anyone.
Great. For many of the Ron Paul supporters, he's the first or the only politician that they've ever trusted, and he earned it. And I guess the question to be answered is, how will you make sure that you're earning the trust of his supporters and the liberty movement and the public at large?
Well, I think people need to look at our record. I think in 2 years or a year and a half, we've done some remarkable things here, from introducing $500 billion worth of cuts, from endorsing and introducing term limits, from endorsing and introducing five-year balanced budget, to fighting the Patriot Act, keeping them up late in the night under duress from both House leadership and Senate leadership when it was about to expire, and insisting on amendments. But when people talk about living up to things, if people make an ideal out there that is something unreal, no one's going to live up to that. And I think many people on this endorsement have decided, that's such a horrible thing. They need to remember that my father endorsed Newt Gingrich. He endorsed John Boehner. He also endorsed Denny Hassert. So he chose between not a liberty-minded candidate. He just chose for various reasons to support different people for Speaker of the House. Does that make him an evil person, or that he was an evil compromiser? No, it makes him like anybody else who's elected to office. They make choices sometimes between what they think is the better of two choices or the less worse of two choices. And so I think people who want to simplify it or oversimplify it need to rethink. My father also endorsed every Republican in the House for Congress in Texas, and always has endorsed or not chosen to endorse against incumbents. There have been many irate Liberty folks saying, why won't Ron Paul endorse against so-and-so incumbent? And some who have followed the internet for the last few years have seen those things come up. So instead of trying to hold me up to some ideal that's not true, why don't we try to acknowledge exactly what the ideal is and what we're trying to hold up to? But what I would say is, judge me on my voting record, judge me on the things I do and the issues. And when you disagree honestly. But I think really what hasn't been good has been, people making death threats, people advising violence, publicizing people's address on the internet. There are some things that are kind of worrisome about this, and I think and hope that people will listen and react responsibly.
Senator Paul, I really appreciate you coming on and spending time with the Daily Paul community. I hope people understand that that you've come on to clear the air. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Kurt.
You've been listening to Daily Paul Radio with Kurt Wallace at dailypaulradio.com and dailypaul.com. I encourage you to be a leader in liberty. We want to thank our sponsor, RonPaulSwag.com, for offering listeners of this podcast the Double Down for Ron Paul sale. Reduced prices on T-shirts, posters, signs, and tons more of the Ron Paul gear over at RonPaulSwag.com.